It is the aftermath of the war to end all wars, and Europe begins to pick up the pieces. While many Germans find the limits imposed on them under the Treaty of Versailles restrictive, a loophole leaves them free to experiment with rocket power, not yet considered an instrument of modern war. The VFR, a spaceflight society founded in Breslau, Germany, gathers together many rocketry enthusiasts. From just 3 members at their first meeting, the society flourishes, attracting hundreds of amateur rocketeers. And in 1933, one of these amateurs has some ideas that catch the eye of the newly elected Nazis. His name is Wernher von Braun. Working under a military grant, von Braun proposes to use liquid propulsion to power rocket flight and goes on to create the V2 rocket. He also comes up with plans for a series of manned vertical takeoff interceptors. This exotic weapon would launch high into the air and swoop down on incoming bombers. But the German Air Ministry, unimpressed with the power of the proposed craft, cancel it in the planning stages. (1941). Hitler's plan for an 11-month war has stretched into 2 years. The German Air Ministry has a new rocket-powered interceptor in development, one slightly more conventional than previous efforts. The Messerschmitt 163, the Komet.
If you want a brief description of it, it's like flying a runaway train.
Before design plans are even complete, General Oberst Ernst Udet orders 70 of these wonder planes into production.
You could describe the Komet as a manned surface-to-air missile. It was not designed to fly long distances. It was designed to take off, climb very fast, shoot down bombers, come back down as fast as possible, land as safely as possible, which could be a neat trick, be refueled, reloaded, and then go up again. That was the theory. In practice, it proved rather more complicated than that.
From the mind of Alexander Martin Lippisch, the Komet is a swept-wing design, but with a novel twist. There's no tail wing. Formerly the director of a glider research group, Lippisch understands the need to reduce total drag on a fast-moving aircraft. This he achieves through his tailless design. As he explains, birds have tails because birds fly slowly, but the Komet is meant to fly fast.
The original designer of that family of aircraft, the flying wings, sort of the tailless aircraft, was Alexander Lippisch. I won't try to pronounce it, but Alexander Lippisch, great aerodynamicist, extremely brilliant gentleman, had done some work before the war on tailless aircraft. He was asked to develop something of a more military nature.
Production of the prototype begins in 1941, under great secrecy. And when it's finally fitted with its Walters engine and ready for its first flight, the pilot, risking his life in the cockpit, is a man named Heini Dittmar. On October 2nd, 1941, the Komet prototype is towed into the air by a Messerschmitt 110 and rises to an altitude of 13,500 feet. Once there, Dittmar releases himself from the 110, turns on the rocket engine, and roars forward, nearly breaking the speed of sound, and finally flying faster than 1,000 kilometers per hour.
It's so rapid, things happen so fast, that It's the only time I've ever been in an airplane I felt was a jump ahead of me.
The Komet prototype is a success, and plans for a fully operational version are given the highest priority. But as the war begins to turn against Germany, it remains uncertain whether the Komet can become operational in time. For Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Great Britain, has failed, and Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, is failing. Need for a wonder weapon is stronger than ever, but development of the Komet interceptor progresses far too slowly. And while the improved version, built to accommodate a larger engine and increased armament, is assembled and ready, its Walter's engine is not. Delayed in part by mechanical errors and in part by lack of support for defensive weapons, it's not until the summer of 1943 that the engine is finally delivered. But now there are new concerns. Although an extremely reliable engine, this reliability comes at a cost. For the engine is powered by two very volatile fuels, 3 parts C-Stoff, a powerful reductant, to 1 part T-Stoff, a deadly peroxide. When mixed, these fuels react instantly and violently, thus creating a powerful rocket propellant, but a dangerous working situation.
What the Germans used was approximately 95% pure peroxide. That thing, when you put it on your skin, didn't make bubbles. It ate you, literally, ate you alive. It had this extremely corrosive effect on human flesh, any flesh, which explains why the pilots and the ground crews had to wear special clothing. You had the equipment, the nozzles, the buckets, everything had to be used and segregated completely.
Fueling, cleaning and refueling of the Messerschmitt Komet is a complicated and dangerous affair. To make room for both fuel tanks in the fuselage, the plane is equipped with jettisonable wheels. Every part of the engine, fuel lines and fuel tanks must be meticulously flushed out after every use. For if even one drop of T-Stoff mixes with C-Stoff outside the engine crucible, the entire plane will explode. But finally, on June the 24th, 1943, the improved version of the Messerschmitt Komet is ready for its maiden flight. The plane is towed out to the runway, and the pilot climbs in. He makes his adjustments and prepares for takeoff. The plane starts traveling at 200 miles per hour down the runway. It jettisons its wheels, pulls up 80 degrees, and rapidly climbs to an altitude of 40,000 feet in an unheard of 3 minutes. When the plane levels off, it quickly accelerates to speeds approaching 900 kilometers per hour, faster than any Allied plane could hope to match.
It had a very, very fast dive, even with no power. And of course, it was entirely a clear weather machine, because when you ran your fuel out, you had to glide back to your airfield. The only thing was, when you got to your airfield, you had to make sure that you had no fuel at all aboard, because they were very explosive fuels, and even a hard landing and some fuel aboard would cause the whole aircraft to disintegrate.
It is more maneuverable around all 3 axes than any known airplane, and nearly 200 are produced for active service. Combat operations begin in 1944, and as expected, Allied fighters are at a complete loss as to how to react. A red version of the plane is produced, recalling aviation legend Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, although not all pilots are happy with this ominous reminder. But still, there are more problems. Because the cockpit is not pressurized, pilots suffer gastrointestinal problems and must be fed special low-fiber diets. Also, the Walter's engine is prone to cutting out during flight, and while the Komet is a highly efficient glider by necessity, it can become difficult to control at top speeds. As such, only very experienced combat pilots are capable of making any enemy kills. And once Allied fighters take note of the Komet's short, powered flight, they wait the plane out, pouncing on it after its engine shuts off. Finally, the superior gliding capability of the swept-wing design proves detrimental to safe landing, causing the aircraft to suddenly rise back into the air with even the slightest updraft. In short, more planes are lost to landing accidents than result in enemy kills.
Messerschmitt and the Luftwaffe certainly knew that the Komet had limitations. An improved version with a pressurized cockpit was developed, for example, the 263, which was, I believe, turned over to Junkers. So it became the Junkers 263. At a very sort of egg-like appearance, landing gear could retract but very narrow track, different engine.
In this design, the fuselage is stretched to accommodate larger fuel tanks for longer range. The new engine is to be equipped with 2 chambers, one to provide power for takeoff and climbing, and the second to provide adjustable cruising power. The aircraft is designed to reach an altitude of 40,000 feet and to still have 100 minutes of fuel left for combat. And it's hoped the new retractable landing gear will prevent any further costly landing accidents. Also, the pressurized cockpit, intended to eliminate pilot health concerns, is to be fitted with a bubble canopy to improve the pilot's rear view. Had this plane become operational, it would certainly have been capable of far more combat kills than its predecessor. But by 1945, progress on the project is so slow that it's only reached the prototype stage. And when the Junkers factory is later overrun by Soviet troops, the one and only completed aircraft is taken back to the Soviet Union.
As a viable combat aircraft, its success was mixed. Given the resources that were poured into it, keeping in mind that Germany, 1943-44 resources were at a premium, you didn't have like money and stuff to throw away, one could argue they might have been better off using something else, like manufacturing other types of aircraft, piston-powered aircraft, fighters, for example. The Komet was pretty much a one-off issue. As an idea, yes, it's a gadget.
And at this point in the war, more fighter aircraft might have indeed made a difference. Now Germany is under direct attack. Air raids by the British Royal Air Force are the heaviest assault to date in the history of aviation warfare. The result of this persistent and merciless bombing is devastating. Huge firestorms are created, killing thousands. Those who don't burn to death in the streets suffocate in their shelters and basements. Germany needs a wonder weapon. But despite its innovation and high speeds, the Komet 163 is not the weapon to turn the tide of war. Since the Komet has not lived up to expectations, Germany looks for new avenues to ward off bomber attacks. On June 6, 1944, the Allies land at Normandy, and step by step, the German defensive lines are pushed back. Soon the British cross the Seine and finally break through the German front, taking Brussels and then Aachen by September of that year. Meanwhile, in the skies, American B-17s wreak havoc on the German mainland. After Hamburg, there's Berlin, and then there's Dresden. Germany is being brought to its knees.
Well, the Germans had this problem. They were attacked on the ground by huge forces of tanks, especially on the Eastern Front. You need powerful weapons. They were also attacked by bombers, daytime, nighttime. So they had to develop very powerful weapons for all these enemies.
And in the southwest of Germany, near the small town of Waldsee, Erich Bochum believes he is designing just such a weapon. The Bochum BA-349 Natter.
The Natter for me is utterly fascinating. It was, for not many people really appreciate it, was the very first vertical takeoff aircraft designed for its role.
Co-founding Bochum Werks in 1941, in 1944, Erich Bochum bases much of the Natter design on Wernher von Braun's rejected 1939 proposal, a proposal Blohm discovered while working at the Fiesler Aircraft Company. Here, a series of Jordanov cutaway diagrams show the simple design of the Natter, beginning with the fuselage and subsequently showing the control column, the Walter's engine, the fuel tank cradle, the fuel tank, and finally the pilot's seat and cockpit. But in spite of its simplicity, it's an uphill battle for Blohm to obtain the support necessary to complete this project.
Initially, he took the idea to the German air ace Adolf Galland. Galland at the time was the general of the fighter air arm. Galland was watching his fighter force being decimated. He was interested in any radical idea that might reverse this trend, so he could see the potential in the Natter.
Unfortunately, however, Galland's hands are tied. While the German Air Ministry initially agreed to 150 planes, by late 1944 they cancelled the project in favour of designs further along in production. So seeing no other choice for Blohm, Galland sends him to make a deal with the devil. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS.
Blohm was granted an audience, and it was clear that Himmler wanted to take the Natter under his control. At this stage, Himmler's power was in the ascendancy.
Himmler's power may be in the ascendancy, but it's not yet unchecked. Earlier that year, he had had Wernher von Braun arrested, only to have Hitler release him 1 month later. So now Himmler operates with some caution. But ultimately, the SS agreed to take control of the Natter project and immediately reorder the 150 planes the Air Ministry cancelled. In response, the Air Ministry reversed their earlier decision and order 50 more for themselves. So finally, construction begins on what is quite possibly the most radical design of World War II. The fuselage is mostly a series of wooden frames covered with plywood sheeting and held together by screws and glue. Only the cockpit, itself contained within a wooden frame, is made of armour for the pilot's protection. The wings are rectangular wooden slabs without flaps or control devices, and the cruciform tail consists of 4 fins and 4 control surfaces. Interestingly enough, the Walter's engine used to power it is the same liquid propellant engine used in the Messerschmitt Komet, requiring both Seestoff and T-Stoff for fuel. However, as additional takeoff thrust is needed, a much older technology is also used. 4 solid fuel rockets, using the same black powder that had been experimented with decades earlier by enthusiastic German rocketeers, are bolted to the aft fuselage. It truly is a radical design.
The Natter was something completely different. You fired it off like a missile, vertically from a ramp. So it was even closer to the idea of the manned missile than the Komet was.
Because the Natter requires no runway, it can be built and launched from almost anywhere. And as both the plane and the pilot are meant to parachute to the ground, not land after flight, there are written instructions on the fuselage on who to call for retrieval. Also, as the Natter's accelerated rate of climb will cause the pilot to temporarily black out on liftoff, it's initially guided by ground radio control. Radically brilliant in its combination of old and new technology, the Natter nevertheless remains a dangerous experiment. And now it's time for a manned test. But who would agree to such a potentially suicidal mission? It's January 1945. The war is going very badly, and the SS, now in complete control of the Natter project, are demanding a manned launch. They begin the search for a qualified pilot, but a pilot of a very particular kind. The kind who might be convinced to accept a mission that could go disastrously wrong. The answer to their prayers is 22-year-old Lothar Sieber. A remarkably experienced pilot, he had worked for the secret KB-200 unit, flying captured Allied bombers, including American B-17s. But 2 years earlier, Sieber had lost his rank of Oberleutnant after being court-martialed on an alcohol-related charge. Demoted to a mere Gefreiter, or private first class, now his only hope of regaining his former rank is the Natter. But there is one snag: Gertrud Nardit, his fiancée. The two are engaged to be married, and the question remains, will Sieber risk his life and the future happiness of the woman he loves just for the rank of Oberleutnant?
They must have been quite deeply in love, because when prior to Sieber taking off in the Natter, he wrote a will the day before, and it's a very touching document in which he says that he leaves all his worldly goods to his fiancée, and as well as that, he said that he would be happy if she would take his name, even though they weren't married, if he should pass on.
So, on the same night he writes his last will and testament, he takes his wife-to-be to the launch site and tells her of his dream. On March the 1st, 1945, Lothar Sieber is the first pilot of the Luftwaffe, the first of the world, to man a vertical takeoff interceptor. The flight lasts 55 seconds and reaches 1,600 feet. But when the canopy is released, Sieber fails to eject himself, and he goes down with the crashing plane. The Balchem Natter's first pilot is dead. The test, a calamity. Nevertheless, in the month that follows, 3 more unmanned test launches are conducted. Shortly after that, the plane is put into operation, with a battery of 10 at Kirchheim, near Stuttgart. So it is, in April 1945, that pilots stand alert, ready at a moment's notice to launch the Natters and engage approaching enemy fighters. But the fighters don't come. The pilots are looking in the wrong direction. For the Allies no longer attack from the sky, but from the ground. On April the 20th, 1945, the US 10th Armored Division drives its tanks and troops into Kirchheim, and the next day crosses the A21 Autobahn into the Natter launch site. Fierce fighting ensues, but there are no Natter planes left for the Allies to capture. Under SS orders, they have all been destroyed. The first manned vertical takeoff interceptor never sees even one day of action. While the mere idea of a wooden supersonic plane is completely unheard of outside the chaos of the Nazi regime, had the Natter fought in battle, it certainly would have caused some damage to the Allied bombing force. For, as unpractical and dangerous as it is, the Natter could still reach a height of 30,000 feet in a matter of minutes, and would be prepared to fight the enemy with a salvo of high-powered rockets.
Having no cannon, the Natter was fitted with rockets, unguided rockets, 55mm Orkans. They would be aimed visually at the pilot. Once he got close enough, he fired them at the bomber. Hopefully 1 or 2 would hit the aircraft. And once that was done, being unarmed, the pilot would sort of break up the aircraft. That's how it worked. It would pull a lever, the canopy, the cockpit section would go one way, the rear of the aircraft would go another way. Both sections would come down, hopefully in one piece, to be reused.
The end would come down by its own parachute, the front part of the fuselage would come down by its other parachute, and at a certain safe height, the pilot could actually just get out and come down by his normal parachute.
The catch is, it was another gadget. If the Komet was a bit of a risky gadget, the Natter was a very risky gadget.
Shortly after Germany's defeat, a complete but broken up Natter airframe is discovered at the German Research Institute for Gliders near Salzburg. Later, 3 more operational units are discovered in a meadow near St. Leonhard in Austria, and at least one of these units is quickly evacuated to the United States for further study. But there, the plane is scorned and scoffed at.
The Natter was not a good idea, was not a good airplane. It was completely impractical. It was damn dangerous. What were they thinking of? I mean, this question of desperation again was in the air. The Germans had all these bright ideas, so they thought. They were completely unfocused. They had all these ideas, but they went nowhere.
The last few months of the war, the Allies had such overwhelming firepower, control of the air. Whatever the Germans would have had, other than the atom bomb, wouldn't have had any effect at all.
But is it really so easy to dismiss German ingenuity? While in practice these wonder weapons certainly did not work as planned, ultimately they do lead to some very important later developments.
The Natter for me is really the precursor in concept terms to the space shuttle. You can send something up, you can get it to do its job, and then it all comes down again and you can reuse it.
For all their differences, both the Blohm Natter and the space shuttle have similarities. Both are monoplanes. Both take off vertically, use liquid propulsion and solid booster rockets, and both are initially guided by autopilot. But then these similarities shouldn't really be all that surprising. For who is the man considered the father of the United States space program but Wernher von Braun? The very same man whose original vertical takeoff proposal inspired Erich Blohm to build the Natter, thus cementing the legacy of Hitler's rocket men.
It is a historical discovery worth its weight in gold. A truly important document of German aviation history is uncovered. It is not found in the archives or by any secret military personnel after the war. It happens instead by accident. On an ordinary day for this factory worker, he discovers a sealed canister containing a drawing. It appears to be a blueprint for the design of an aircraft. On closer inspection, the document dates back to the mid-1920s. What it turns out to be are the workings of a deadly state-of-the-art bomber, illegal in Germany at that time. Its origins are inspired by this strangely designed plane. It may look backwards, but the logic behind the design is truly forward in thinking. It is one of the original tail-first Canard-designed planes, and the concept behind it demonstrates Germany's desire to be at aviation's vanguard.
In the Ente, again the duck, late 20s, they had this design. Tail first, not really an airliner, but a few seats. The tail first design would allow you to triumph against the stall. The stall was very much a feared thing. You lose control, you crash. A Canard, a tail first design, can say that if forward tail stalls, nose goes down, pick up speed, airplane stays in the air, all is well. The prototype flew around 1927-28, worked quite well.
It is an unconventional design by an unconventional designer. Heinrich Focke is hoping to remove one of the pilot's biggest concerns since the birth of aviation, the dreaded stall factor. Thus, the design is catching the attention of aviation enthusiasts from around the world. Innovative as the F-19 may be, it is not without its flaws.
Eventually, it crashed. If you lose control of it at low level, it's deadly. And Mr. Wolf, the Wolf of the Focke-Wulf, he's the one who died in the crash.
With the death of their founder, and with military aircraft strictly forbidden in Germany, those at Focke-Wulf are now at a fork in the road. Do they keep on developing Canard technology for peaceful and, most importantly, legal purposes? or do they risk both the company's future and their freedom by turning it into a deadly weapon of force? In an extremely risky decision in the history of the company, the plan for the F-19 dramatically changes. Instead of being the originally planned sports plane, it is now going to be a deadly bomber, capable of causing tremendous havoc over Europe's skies. The man behind this madness is one of Germany's true engineering geniuses, Kurt Tank, who joins Focke-Wulf as a result of a company takeover. Being there every step of the way, he harnesses and perfects this technology into what becomes known as the Model 42. The source of funding for this ambitious project in an economically starved country is still unknown. However, there is one thing for certain. Germany's quest to rule the skies is something neither military defeat nor monetary limitation can stop.
Tail-first design was developed for a number of reasons. If you have a Canard configuration, you have a very thin nose because your engine is behind the pilot. You can technically, at least in theory, increase speed with the same amount of power, which is good for combat aircraft. Also, because you have a fairly thin nose, you can improve, to a certain extent, pilot visibility.
When completed, this aircraft, powered by BMW's V12 engines and possessing a maximum speed of 200 miles an hour, is for Germany both her sword and shield. Any potential enemy will think twice about pushing around a Germany possessing an arsenal of aircraft carrying 20 200-pound bombs on board. More importantly, if Germany desires to reclaim her lost territories following the Treaty of Versailles, the Model 42 can put immense fear into both Europe's citizens and industries with its capability of causing enormous destruction. As testing rapidly advances, ironically, the rug is pulled from underneath them by neither pacifists nor neighboring European powers, but by the most militaristic regime in history. As Hitler's Nazi Party comes to power in 1933, the newly installed Chancellor's main interests are in maintaining and consolidating his power. An illegal aircraft project, if discovered, could be the end to his fragile rule. As a result, the project dies alongside German democracy. Although the Model 42's future is ended with the single stroke of a pen, the concept of Canard technology lives on. Focke-Wulf obeys the government's decision, but at the same time rapidly develops what is known as short takeoff and landing technology. One of its crown jewels is the FW-61, the world's first fully controllable helicopter. Its creator, Professor Heinrich Focke's, much like his German predecessors, symbolizes that an idea can never be defeated, no matter what obstacles it may face. Had this bomber plane been approved for production on a massive scale, one can only imagine what impact it would have had on the Second World War. It is one of the conflict's greatest what-ifs. In fighting both Britain and the Soviet Union, it might well have tipped the scale in favor of Germany. The Model 42 thus may have resulted in a soaring victory and changed dramatically the outcome of the war in Europe.
I name you hero and wish you good luck and Godspeed to all who fly in this type. Yeah? Thank you very much.
Despite the enthusiasm at Handley Page, the mood in England at this time is anything but cheerful. By 1937, the drums of war are beginning to be heard across the nation. Never has this been more evident than at these factories, where the Harrow is being introduced in an attempt to showcase Britain's military power. Unfortunately, it is technologically years behind the now cancelled Model 42. With $400 million being spent on aviation in a single year, the government assures its citizens that they have nothing to fear with this powerful weapon on their side. However, the question remains as to whether these bombers can stand up to the growing German threat. These fears are finally realized as Britain's cities are repeatedly bombed by the Luftwaffe, causing enormous destruction and loss of life. The Blitz has now focused the world's attention to what the bomber is capable of doing. The nation everyone is looking to is in dire need of a solution to this deadly problem. It may be one of Britain's most unusual designs for a plane. At Miles Aircraft, this prototype, known as the Libellula, marks not only the resurrection of the Canard design, but also exemplifies a company truly thinking outside the box.
People were very appreciative of the fact that Miles had this wonderful innovatory streak in them, and that they might come up trumps with something.
During the war in Reading, Berkshire, the factories of Miles Aircraft are working overtime, making a substantial contribution to the nation's war effort. What is capturing the imagination of the company's top designers is the reconstruction of a revolutionary aircraft. A plane that will capture massive attention with a design so futuristic that it is years ahead of its time. Hard at work with their initial sketches by ambitious and intelligent designers, the Canard plane is reborn. In this factory, British men and women are side by side, hard at work putting together this complicated design. While their soldiers are fighting on the front lines, these workers have stayed behind. Their job is to maintain the production of wartime equipment on the home front. And a mighty task for them is to construct this unusual plane possessing a tandem wing arrangement, requiring countless hours of labor. Unlike standard aircraft, the Libellula M35 has its wings at different heights and at different lengths. The reason for this is that the lesser wing acts as a forward-mounted stabilizer, thus improving control, especially in regards to landing. With its shorter wingspan and not requiring them to fold, when completed, the M35 is to be used as a carrier-borne naval fighter. Its sister plane, the second of the Libellulas, with an additional engine, is intended strictly for bombing purposes. Its creator, George Miles, says that when completed, the plane will resemble a dragonfly. In just 90 days, the first plane is built, remarkable for its time. Those at Miles Aircraft are determined to see what this plane can do once it is up in the air. Getting the plane ready for flight, engineers are putting the Libellula in position. As the final inspections are being conducted both underneath the plane and in the cockpit, the company, having a huge investment in the aircraft's success, hopes to put it into mass production shortly, pending government approval. Possessing a tricycle landing gear, the intent is to achieve complete stability when landing. At the rear of the wings are the corresponding vertical and horizontal stabilizers and rudders. Once in the air, the plane is able to fly at 160 miles an hour and climb at a rate of 1,100 feet a minute. Its Canard features lend the aircraft well to both high and low-speed flight. With all of its advantages, however, the Libellula is not without its drawbacks.
So the Libellula, the problem was to control the aircraft for takeoff and landing. It had two sets of flaps with 5 settings for each set. So you had a potential 10 combinations. This was difficult because getting the right combination was one thing, because every time you changed the combination, it had some effect on the controllability of the aircraft. And it was really impractical.
Complexity becomes its Achilles heel. And despite the optimism from those involved in both the flying and the making of the plane, the military situation at the time dictates that the Libellula must come in for a political landing. In many ways, it is surprising that both versions of the design never go into mass production. However, its fate, similar to that of the Model 42, rests not on the aspiration of its designers, but on external circumstances. Britain, now with the United States and the Soviet Union as allies, is turning the tide against the German war machine. As a result, the demand for the Libellula evaporates. With prospects for the Canard design now looking all but dead, miraculously, it once again is resurrected. This time, however, it is not done by any European power. Instead, it is done across the Atlantic Ocean, in America, the birthplace of aviation. Here, the Canard design is reincarnated. The United States, referred to by Japanese Admiral Yamamoto as the sleeping giant, has awakened. Having an industrial capacity second to none, geography is the country's greatest asset. A massive labor force working uninterrupted without fear of factories being bombed is Uncle Sam's greatest advantage. And aircraft production is no exception. In terms of quantity, the United States is the undisputed champion. No European nation can even come close to their rate of production. However, while the country leads in quantity, it is quality that one aircraft company aspires to excel at.
But there was definitely a potential there. So Lockheed started to look at what kind of airplane could be designed around a turbine engine for high-performance aircraft.
It is Lockheed who believes it has the jet-powered solution for the fighter. One of its most secret projects of the war is the L-133 prototype, which is tested to see if this new technology can be harnessed into something tangible for the United States military. Thus, the Canard design, an important component of the project, rises from the ashes. At first, the Army Air Force show interest in the project. The emerging military-industrial complex, however, dictates the final decision, with it becoming a case of quality versus quantity that ultimately determines the project's future.
They looked at it and sort of, well, this is all very interesting, but you have an engine that's a wee bit on the complicated side, and you're producing Hudsons for the Brits, Lightnings for us, you're producing light transport aircraft, and in some cases, like Lightning, for example, your deliveries are good, but may not be quite as good as we would like them to be. And you want to get involved in the design of a new type of engine and a new type of aircraft. Please slow down. Our enthusiasm is not necessarily there.
With war raging on in both Europe and the Pacific, a policy of producing what is known and reliable is enacted. Every second must be accounted for. With the possibility of the model not functioning properly, precious time must not be spent testing the unknown. Thus, the L-133 becomes, much like the Model 42 and the Libellula, an aircraft whose potential remained unfulfilled. There is no doubting, however, with its state-of-the-art technology, the development of the L-133 would have brought Canard technology to a new level. It is the right place, just not the right time for Lockheed. To the employees at Curtiss-Wright and Canard enthusiasts, deliverance has arrived with the XP-55, known as the Ascender. With the main wings located at the tail end of the fuselage, it is certain to attract attention due to its unique design.
Presenting the Army's new Ascender plane. With its elevator controls in the nose and its motor and propeller in the rear, this push-propelled fighter reverses conventional airplane design. Developed experimentally as the XP-55, the new plane gives forward vision for the pilot and a clear path for his gunfire. In action, the darting tail-first Ascender seems to fly backwards.
Its origins lie in an Army Air Corps flirtation with unconventional aircraft design. And nothing defines the unconventional like the tail-first plane. Despite a policy of turning out proven aircraft on a massive scale, there is some room for experimenting. Originally intended as a design to be powered by Pratt & Whitney liquid-cooled H engines, it is perhaps the best chance Canard technology has of becoming more than just a blueprint or a workable prototype. Mass-scale production is the ultimate goal of its enthusiasts. After extensive testing, it appears that the Ascender is the best hope in achieving this goal. The Air Corps is impressed so far and asks for 3 prototypes to be built. The plane's future, however, comes crashing down with its first prototype. A stalling malfunction results in the first Ascender taking a 16,000-foot nosedive. As the company attempts to fix this problem, competing technology is evolving faster than XP-55. In the end, the project is cancelled indefinitely. It is not worth either the government's time or money, to further pursue such a risky endeavor. Despite its name, in the end, the plane does nothing but descend into the depths of aviation history. By 1945, as Japan enters the fourth year in its war against the United States, the sleeping giant that Admiral Yamamoto feared would awake is now on his nation's doorstep. After massive casualties on both sides, American military power is successful in pushing back Japanese forces through both its superior air and sea power. The American mainland remains untouched after Pearl Harbor, with military production skyrocketing. Japan, a nation that seemed invincible in early 1942, is now feeling this incredible American force wreak havoc over its mainland. In particular, Japanese cities and their inhabitants feel the horrors of an air war that does not distinguish between military and civilian targets. American B-29s, leaving from the islands of Guam and Saipan, fly a total of 107 bombing raid missions on Japan's cities in just 1 year. One particular raid that takes place on the night of March the 9th destroys 250,000 homes and burns almost 100,000 citizens to death. In General MacArthur's historical report, he writes that the effect of these raids rocked the nation to its very foundations. With each passing month, the casualties keep escalating, with nearly 3 million people killed. Mass famine is spreading, with an estimated 10 million people suffering from serious malnutrition. Japanese Admiral Matomi Ogaki, writing in his diary on June the 18th, asks, "Does the enemy intend to destroy all of the cities in this country?" General Curtis LeMay, a key architect of this bombing strategy, pledges to bomb and burn them until they quit. The only problem for LeMay is that with a schedule of approximately 16 burn jobs on urban industrial areas every 3 to 4 days, by mid-August, American bombers will run out of cities to destroy. Japanese air forces are proving incapable of preventing this mass destruction of their homeland. A carrier raid in March of 1945 results in 161 out of 193 Japanese aircraft being shot down by American forces. Vice Admiral John S. McCain pledges to hunt down and destroy every damn plane in Japan. Despite the much-feared kamikaze tactics being employed by Japanese pilots, American military leaders are no longer planning the possibility, but the eventuality, of Japan's surrender. The maps being used by both the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the President show that whether it is through a ground force invasion or through the dropping of an atomic bomb, Japan is a nation on the brink of defeat. The only decision being made by the political and military leaders of the United States is which course of action they should embark on in order to achieve the goal of an unconditional surrender. To those Japanese military leaders who are in their last throes, their hope is to develop a highly maneuverable interceptor plane to act as an antidote against American B-29s. The Shinden aircraft, developed by Kyushu, is the only aircraft with a Canard design to be ordered into quantity production during the Second World War. Equipped to hold one pilot and having a wingspan of 36 feet, armed with 4 30mm cannons and a top speed of 466 miles per hour, in addition to its important Canard features, the Japanese military is hoping that Shinden holds the answer to solving the problem of the B-29 bomber. Work begins in June of 1944 to develop this plane, whose name translates to Magnificent Lightning. By now, however, time is not something Japan has on its side. Although the first prototype of the Shinden flies on August the 3rd, it is simply too late to prevent a devastating American attack. 3 days after it is tested, the first atomic bomb is dropped on Hiroshima. 3 days later, the city of Nagasaki is dealt the same blow. With these 2 bombings, in addition to the Soviet Union declaring war against Japan, the demand of unconditional surrender is met on September the 2nd, 1945, marking the end to war in the Pacific. The story of the Shinden remains one of the greatest what-ifs in Second World War history. Had Japanese production and testing begun earlier, Would this aircraft have been able to stop American bombing plans as hoped? If the jet technology for this aircraft arrived in time, would the Shinden have been to Japan what the Spitfire and Hurricane had been to Britain in its time of need? For it remains an unknown piece of Canard history. The Canard design, with its origins dating back to the Wright brothers and their first flight of 1903, is a story of aviation constantly having to overcome the barriers and obstacles put in its way. It is a story of emerging and innovative technology locking horns with the politics of its time. Whether it is a result of a new government taking power, the policies of production, or of a country in desperation, Canard technology never soars above these barricades in the first half of the 20th century. There is no doubting, however, what Canard technology represents in the history of aviation. It symbolizes the innovative spirit, and it symbolizes the proud heritage of aviation. The Canard design is to be remembered through its planes and by the people that created them.
During the early stages of the Cold War, and before the advent of guided missiles, the West had to rely heavily upon jet-powered fighters to ward off Soviet bombers. For some time, the only effective armament for these fighters were barrages of unguided missiles.
One of the changes that took place in the 1950s involved air-to-air weapons. It had been traditional until then that combat airplanes would carry machine guns or cannons. And everyone knew and everyone said that fighters need guns, except when they didn't say that. And they didn't say that when they were talking about defending the United States against bomber attack. They designed several types of interceptors that used partly or entirely unguided air-to-air rocket projectiles.
At first, each interceptor would just have one opportunity to fire in a gunshot approach with a weapon from a bygone war. The B-29 was more expensive to develop than the atom bomb. It was so complex to build that some manufacturers are said to have taken on other projects just to avoid being selected to assemble this most advanced flying machine. Even Boeing didn't really want the task of building their own creation. In the end, the Army Air Force took over much of the management, although Boeing, Bell and Martin still had to deliver. The B-29 was cloaked in secrecy throughout its early development. Occasionally details were released, but this was really disinformation to confuse the enemy, who by 1944 had seen enough of the superfortress to fear its destructive capability. In one such subterfuge, a single B-29 was landed near London to convince the German High Command that many other B-29s were to follow. The result was that Germany took extensive precautions to counter the superfortress, although none were necessary as the United States never planned to attack Germany with B-29s. The war against the Japanese Empire was a very different matter. Japan was the target that the superfortress was conceived and built to attack. Rushed into service, many early B-29s flew over Japan with technical problems, particularly with engines overheating. One safe haven for a damaged and struggling superfortress was the Soviet port of Vladivostok. At this time, Russia was not a combatant with Japan. In fact, it was technically a neutral power that could not give support to either the United States or Japan. At least 3 B-29s were forced to land in Vladivostok. They were promptly seized, repaired, and flown to Moscow. Just before the Japanese surrendered, Russia declared war on Japan, which made them a US ally in the Pacific. But Russia still refused to return the 3 B-29s. American wisdom was that a superfortress would be technically too sophisticated for Soviet engineers to replicate. And that view prevailed for several years, even as the Soviet relationship deteriorated from ally to enemy. However, in 1947, at Moscow's annual Aviation Day parade, 3 B-29s appeared overhead. At first, Western observers assumed they were American, but opinion quickly changed when a fourth identical aircraft appeared. Soviet engineers had obviously developed a clone. This was bad news on the aviation front, but worse still was the knowledge that the Soviets had for some time breached Western security and had gained access to atomic secrets. The Los Alamos project alone had at least 3 Soviet spies in its workforce. In August 1949, the Soviets, in an exercise known as First Lightning, detonated their first atomic bomb. The news shocked the West. Soviet possession of the atom bomb and the means to deliver it demanded an effective response. However, most Western air forces at the time were still flying fighters from World War II. Anticipating the nuclear threat, in 1946 a new air defense command had been formed for the aerial protection of the continental United States. At first, the ADC had to rely upon a stalwart Second World War night fighter, the Northrop P-61 Black Widow. The aircraft offered some radar capability, long-range and all-weather endurance, but most important of all, it was available. Later, an unusual derivative of the successful P-51 Mustang, the P-82 Twin Mustang, was pressed into service. The original P-82 was envisioned as an escort fighter. It was fitted with radar and served as an ADC interceptor. However, neither of these aircraft had the speed of a jet, and they relied upon machine guns or cannons, neither of which were likely to be very effective against a B-29, wherever it was built. Having designed the superfortress in the first place, the US knew only too well its defensive capability. The task of successfully downing a B-29 had been given to German engineers some years earlier, when the Nazi hierarchy were tricked into believing that superfortresses would be used over Germany. The Wehrmacht's answer came in the form of the A4M rocket. The rocket had been developed from an artillery missile of slightly less than 3 inches diameter and had 8 folding fins. These would be fired in a salvo at an oncoming American bomber. The salvo approach was necessary because the rockets lacked accuracy. Allied intelligence had been aware of the A4M's devastating effect when they hit a target, especially when coupled with the speed of an Me-262. Against this arrangement, the Allies had no answer.
One of the weapons that really, I think, would have been a very frightening thing if it had gone much further was the Me-262 armed with the R4M rocket missiles. Now, they had 2 batteries or 2 racks of 12 in each wing, and they were used right at the end of the war. Not in a great deal, but when they struck a bomber, it wasn't a question of damaging it, downing it. It was a question of disintegrating the entire thing. it was a hit was total destruction.
The technology was really quite basic. In the 262's case, the launch platforms were basically carved out of wood. Other German interceptors using the A4M were fired from a simple metal tube nicknamed the stovepipe. Apart from the A4M's motor, the only other technology it employed was its folding fins, which snapped open after launch. FW-190s and Me-262s were adapted to use Germany's new rocket defense. However, there was one aircraft that was built around the A4M, extremely ambitious and reflecting the desperate state of the Third Reich. The Bachem Natter's sole reason for existence was to deliver the deadly folding fin rocket. The Natter used a chemical-driven Walter rocket as its main motor. 4 solid-fueled rocket power plants aided its vertical takeoff. Bachem's design only flew on one occasion and killed its young pilot in the process. But knowing of its deadly potential, Allied ground troops were to prioritize the capture of anything to do with the A4M. Fast forward to 1949. NATO gives Russia's clone nuclear bomber the codename Bull. By this time, some of America's first-generation Air Defense Command jets were close to delivery. Many of them were developed for use with 2 valuable assets that would help reduce the Soviet threat. Firstly, the US had improved on the A4M concept with the introduction of a 4-finned, 2.75-inch rocket that would ultimately be named Mighty Mouse, after the popular cartoon character of the time.
Quite a few of the aircraft projects in the 1950s did away with the gun. It was thought the gun, and in other words, close-in fighting was no longer required. It would be air-to-air missiles. But you can only carry a small number of missiles at the time. And so an alternative to the gun was the unguided rocket. In America, the version was known as the Mighty Mouse.
Airborne radar was also coming of age. First employed at the end of World War II, it was now ready for use in conjunction with ground radar. Radar was particularly important when employing fighters known as interceptors, as they are required to fly at night and in all weather conditions. In 1945, the US Army Air Force was preparing to enter the jet age and had asked for submissions for a jet-powered night fighter to replace the propeller-driven aircraft it then had in service. A serious contender for this contract was the Nighthawk, a 4-engined dual-seat interceptor from the Curtiss-Wright Company. The Nighthawk's failure to perform in flight tests in 1948 led to the demise of the Curtiss-Wright Company. Instead, Air Defense Command chose a contender from Northrop. The F-89 Scorpion had 2 engines for safety and dual seats, one for a dedicated radar operator. The Scorpion was to be equipped with cannons because Mighty Mouse was not yet available. Delays in delivery of the F-89s had the advantage of enabling them all to be fitted with folding fin rockets. In fact, the Scorpion could carry 102 of the rockets.
The F-89, which was quite an interesting aircraft with big rocket pods out on the end of the wing, and pretty heavy aircraft, but the usual case that we've done in so many of our aircraft, by the time we get through hanging things on them, they're all underpowered. and the F-89 didn't last long, but it was one of the airplanes in the air defense development that took place as we moved into the Cold War time frame and our expectations that we might have to fight Russia.
However, late delivery of the F-89s at this very sensitive time in history led Air Defense Command to order 2 other interceptors as immediate backup. Lockheed calculated that they could convert the T-33 trainer to a 2-seat interceptor using up to 75% of the Tu-33's parts, a major saving in money, and more importantly, time. ADC was very impressed, as the first flight of the XF-94 was made just 3 months after the contract was signed. The latest C version of the Starfire carried Mighty Mouse rockets, just as they were starting to become available. The second backup for the Scorpion was a North American aviation project. The company's F-86 Saber had been a major step forward in fighter design, but it was primarily a dogfighter, not an interceptor. But North American believed that the basic frame could be converted into the interceptor role. In the event, only about 25% of the original F-86 parts were used to make the F-86D or Saber Dog. Nevertheless, their unit cost was around 1/3 of the twin-engine Scorpion. Nearly all the 2,800 F-86Ds that rolled out of North American's plant were armed with the Mighty Mouse rocket. Like the Nazis' Natter interceptor rocket, it existed solely for the purpose of delivering 2.75-inch folding fin rockets.
The F-86D didn't have any guns. The F-86D Saber carried a tray of these rockets under the pilot. The tray had to be extended, then the rockets could be fired.
There was another interceptor that would be armed with the folding fin projectile, the Canadian CF-100.
We had 2 rocket pods, 29 rockets each. And so there's 58 total, and it was a one-shot effort. So when you were into a bomber stream and locked onto the bomber, you would fire these things off, and it was essentially a shotgun type approach. You're bound to hit something. One rocket would do the job.
Canada's Arctic region required an all-weather aircraft. Like the Scorpion and the Starfire, the CF-100 had a 2-seat configuration with a dedicated radar operator in the rear. Working in conjunction with a string of early warning radar posts, almost 700 CF-100s were built. They served for almost 30 years. So important was the project that Avro Canada cancelled its promising early jet airliner design to concentrate on its rocket-firing defender of North America. Eventually, Mighty Mouse rockets were superseded by supersonic surface-to-air missiles like the Boeing Beaumark. Army Nike shorter-range anti-aircraft missiles took over much of the air defense role in the mid to late 50s. Air Defense Command did retain the use of some Mighty Mouse rockets on its new generation interceptor, the F-102 Dagger, but only as support for the Falcon-guided missile, which was the Dagger's primary weapon. As guided missile technology improved, the Mighty Mouse was no longer able to compete for a spot on board U.S. interceptors.
Unguided rockets. They didn't have very much range. They were unguided, and of course the moment you fired them, they were under the effect of gravity, so actually getting them to actually hit a target, anything beyond a very short distance, was really not much chance. And so needless to say, by the 1960s, this weapon wasn't carried very often at all.
During the Vietnam War, the 2.75-inch rocket was paired with armed helicopters, and it was reborn as a ground attack weapon. Literally millions of Mighty Mouse rockets were launched against North Vietnamese targets from a wide range of U.S. rotary and fixed-wing aircraft. Specialized warheads could be fitted onto the rockets depending on their intended end use, be it anti-personnel, anti-tank, or basic target marking. During the Gulf War, the Apache helicopters that opened the air campaign by destroying 2 Iraqi radar sites with Hellfire missiles also carried Hydra 70 rockets, the modern-day incarnation of the Mighty Mouse. The folding fin rocket was born out of the Reich's desperate need to stop the flow of Allied bombers devastating its territory. When faced with the possibility of nuclear annihilation by Soviet bombers, the US grabbed onto this German weapon and adapted it into their own Mighty Mouse. Though surface-to-air missiles and air-to-air missiles would relieve the Mighty Mouse of its intended mission of knocking down Soviet bombers, the folding fin rocket would find new life as a ground attack weapon, a mission it still carries out to this day.
In 1938, Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Göring declares, "I completely lack the bombers capable of round-trip flights to New York with a 5-ton bomb load. I would be extremely happy to possess such a bomber, which would at last stuff the mouth of arrogance across the sea." 4 years after that statement is made, the nation of Germany begins to feel the industrial strength of America firsthand. Bombers begin pounding the Nazi regime day after day with attacks from England. With the United States means of production out of reach, any hope of retaliation seems impossible. Little do American leaders know that 3 planes are being developed in order to do just that. Messerschmitt 264, Junkers 390, and Focke-Wulf Ta 400 are being rushed into production to make it across the Atlantic in order to reciprocate this destruction. It is a project cloaked in secrecy for more than 70 years. Many details are sketchy, based on hearsay and unsubstantiated claims. Now take an in-depth look at both the planes and the possibilities they represented. Could they have tipped the scale in favor of the Axis so late in the war? Could they have actually made it across the ocean and back without refueling? Explore alongside historians and experts the story of the America bombers. On December the 11th, 1941, Hitler declares war against the United States of America. Ever since the Second World War has begun, the 2 nations have been battling it out unofficially in the Atlantic Ocean.
Hitler probably declares war on the United States because there's already an undeclared war going on against the United States of America. In the North Atlantic, with U.S. destroyers, U-boats. So he may think it's simply inevitable. But whether he thinks it's inevitable or not, it probably wasn't. And it's a terrible mistake on his part.
We came in the war because of the Japanese, because of Hitler's stupid agreement with the Japanese. And he lived up to his agreement, but it really did cost him the war. You know, if he'd never made the alliance with Japan, you know, we might be doing this interview in German.
Before Pearl Harbor, America supplies the Allies with war materials, causing its ships and German U-boats to clash as a result.
It is quite clear that the United States had broken their neutrality at least 6 months before Pearl Harbor by assisting the British in getting the convoys from the United States to Britain safely and without being attacked by German submarines. So there was actually this warlike activity already in existence between American destroyers and German submarines without there being a public state of war.
Just prior to Pearl Harbor, there are a series of incidents in the North Atlantic. 3 destroyers are involved in altercations with German U-boats. The Greer, the Kearney, and the Reuben James. And there's an escalation with each one. And with the Carney, it's merely an exchange of fire. There's a torpedo fired at the rear after a U.S. plane takes a shot at the submarine. With the Carney, the ship is actually hit with a loss of U.S. life. And with the Reuben James, that is sunk. And Roosevelt points to this as a reason for increased vigilance and activity against the Nazis. And it's a question of who fires first and all that.
For Hitler, the decision is an easy one. The United States will no longer be considered neutral. The gloves can finally come off. Its shipping capabilities are now fair game for German submarines. Once victory is declared over the Soviet Union, America and Britain will sue for peace. That is the Nazi plan. In less than a year, however, the exact opposite happens. Fighting against both Japan and Germany, the arsenal of democracy only grows stronger.
The Americans, again, had the resources, they had the industry, they had the time, and this huge industry that could produce trainers, fighters, light bombers, medium bombers, heavy bombers, patrol bombers, any type of aircraft you can think of, and the tanks, and the trucks, and produce the gasoline, and the munitions, and everything else, and the ships. Huge navy. They could do all of that at the same time. The Germans couldn't.
Factories begin turning out a plane every 5 minutes and a ship every day.
American factories were in 24/7 production by the end of 1942, and in 43 and 44 not only armed one of the largest militaries in the world, but armed our allies as well, the British, the Soviet Union. In the course of the war, we gave somewhere around 50,000 trucks to the Soviet Union, 15,000 tanks, 7,000 aircraft.
The United States has a unique advantage due to its geography. It does not have to worry about planes bombing their factories. It can go on producing at an unprecedented level.
America never really gets out of the Great Depression until World War II comes along. The unemployment figures were as high as 14–17% in the late 1930s, and they really don't start to drop until America becomes the arsenal of democracy, supplying Britain and the Allies and shipping literally billions of dollars overseas. The Lend-Lease program ultimately is $50 billion by itself, which in the dollars of today is about $800 billion, a tremendous stimulus package for the American economy.
They were delivering huge numbers of aircraft and tanks, and vehicles, trucks, etc. to the British and the Canadians and the Australians, etc. So they were a major producer of weapons for the Allies.
And having two oceans protecting its civilian population, the American people are confident that they're providing materials that will shift the balance of power away from the Axis.
Economists say the natural resources of the United Nations are greater, but the capacity of the Axis to turn what resources they have into weapons of war is tremendous. They have the mighty Krupp munitions works. We have Birmingham. They have Skoda. We have Delaware. They have factories like this in occupied France. England has Vickers. They seized the steel mills of Luxembourg. We have Pittsburgh. They have great factories to turn out Heinkels, Messerschmitts, Dorniers. We turn out flying Fortresses, P-38s, P-40s, Aerocobras, Tomahawks, many others. Romanian oil drives their planes and tanks. Oil from the fields of Oklahoma, Texas, and California will drive our planes and tanks.
For German leaders, the United States poses a serious dilemma. With more than 5,000 miles separating the two countries, no existing German aircraft can even come close to reaching America's east coast. In early 1942, the only strategy available to Nazi war planners is unrestricted submarine warfare.
One of the most successful weapons that the Nazis had was the U-boat fleet, the U-boat service, the Kriegsmarine, which is essentially, by the end of the war, a U-boat navy. They were in 1942. They were wildly successful. It looked like they were going to just win the war just by sinking everything in the Atlantic.
A plan known as Operation Drumbeat begins with U-boats torpedoing America's shores, sinking millions of tons of shipping.
Well, the Americans, of course, were very much surprised by the immediate reaction of, or action, not action by German submarines after the war has been declared by Germany. Germany at that particular time sent a group of submarines over to the American coast, and America was totally unprepared for that kind of assault. And the German submarines over there found absolutely no opposition whatsoever, and it was partly a Turkish shoot for them. The ships were illuminated; they were not in convoys. The cities were not blacked out, so it was partly for them almost a peacetime-like exercise they did, and of course they were very, very successful in doing so, and put America into a state of shock from which it took them many, many months to recover.
Operation Drumbeat, or Paukenschlag in the original German, was the first U-boat offensive against the east coast of the United States. And to say that it was a happy time for the U-boats and their crews is understating the case considerably. And in fact, many of them did look back on it as those who survived the war look back on 1942 as just kind of a happy hunting time. It takes all modern nations some time to gear up into a war posture, and it might take democracies longer than dictatorships, and it might take our fractious and argumentative democracy in America even longer than some. And certainly the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, and we were at war a couple of days later, but it's not to say we took it with the seriousness that it deserved. And something as simple as blacking out cities on the East Coast was policies and procedures would have to be drawn up. It's not simply a case of everyone in New York turning out their lights at the same time. Now, with illuminated cities along the East Coast, every single American transport which sailed from harbor was nicely silhouetted against a bright background of lights. And U-boat and submarine commanders just could not have had a juicier or more lucrative target. And these experienced crews took advantage of it, sinking somewhere around 2 million tons of shipping in 1942.
Caught off guard, it takes time for American war planners to augment their strategy in dealing with this submarine menace. Through the use of a convoy system, as well as ordering mandatory blackouts, Operation Drumbeat fades away.
The turning point can be placed at early 1943, and in May, I think, when we lost about 40 boats in 1 month or something like that.
By 1943, materials and supplies begin reaching Britain with little interruption. Once on English soil, their impact is felt immediately. B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators begin flying over the heart of Germany. Alongside British planes, the fatherland is bombed mercilessly.
The offensive continues in greater and greater strength.
Well, certainly German industries took a pounding. German civilians took a pounding. Winston Churchill probably put it best when he once said that the air effort was dehousing the German people, destroying their living quarters one building at a time.
Cities are turned into rubble. And with Soviet victories on the Eastern Front, the Allied powers begin closing in on the Axis. Hitler, seeing the destruction firsthand, is outraged at these bombings. However, with his U-boats neutralized and the United States out of reach, there's little Nazi generals can do to fight back against the American war machine. What is needed is a wonder weapon to enact revenge. Beginning as early as the interwar period, German war planners study a hypothetical attack on the United States.
Dornberger, assisted by Werner von Braun, had been thinking about some kind of a rocket-propelled weapon that could attack the United States as far back as 1937. There was a weapon that they were designing called variously either the New York bomb or the American rocket. It had an interesting intent. They would take a massive, massive booster rocket, put a V2 at the top of it, fire it off, and the V2 would eventually attain speeds of 6,000 miles an hour, which meant that it could cross the Atlantic in something like 40 minutes. It could strike New York, it could strike Washington, it could strike Boston.
Of course, you can never laugh these things off because the Germans were so innovative that sometimes they achieved things which to many minds were quite impossible.
The Germans were never able to launch any sort of attack on the continental United States. That's not to say they didn't talk about it, they didn't plan on doing it, and they didn't drop various schemes for doing it, some relatively realistic and some much more fanciful.
Many concepts are examined and many are rejected due to their technological limitations.
There was the notion, for example, of launching a V-1, the so-called buzz bomb, in some ways the distant ancestor of our modern cruise missile, of launching a V-1 from a ramp on the deck of a U-boat that had surfaced off of the American coast. Now, of course, the problem of getting a German U-boat to the American coast with a large ramp and a buzz bomb on top of it was never really dealt with.
Some of these ideas even border on the realm of a science fiction novel.
Likewise, there was a plan for towing a V-2. Now, the V-2 being the not-so-distant ancestor of the post-World War II intercontinental ballistic missile, of taking a V-2, encasing it in its own missile launcher, and then putting it into position on the back of a U-boat. The launcher would swing into a vertical position, that is a launch position, and thus then launch the weapon against an American city, presumably New York, and presumably Manhattan. Now, the problems with such a plan, of course, include getting, once again, that V-2 over the Atlantic Ocean, crawling with U.S. naval vessels of various shapes and sizes, not to mention our own submarine fleet, and doing so while trailing an extremely heavy and extremely obvious 118-foot-long canister without being detected.
The most realistic and achievable weapon is a long-range bomber.
In 1939, things in Europe were not going too well, and war clouds were beginning to erupt. It was then that Hitler realized, and some of the hierarchy in the Luftwaffe realized, that they may need something that could fly a little bit further than what they originally conceived. So they put out a specification to try and get a bomber that might reach the United States.
Attacking the American East Coast with raids the same way the B-17 is attacking the fatherland.
The Germans were very intent on finding some way that they could strike the United States by air. Besides having worked on rocketry, they were also developing a bomber.
So the Germans realized that at one point, if you wanted to stop or at least put a brake on the production effort in the US, you would have to put some threat over their heads. The only way to do that would be to bomb them.
Unfortunately for the Nazis, it's a goal that's difficult at best. For a plan like this to work, it must reach America and back without refueling.
The problem that the Germans faced in building a long-range bomber is long-range. It had to go across the Atlantic, bomb New York City, maybe a little slack time there in case they ran into some fighters or something, and then it had to turn around nonstop without landing and fly back to Norway or the west coast of France, which this is a long trip, and nobody does this today. Your 747 doesn't do this today. They'll land in Europe or in England and refuel and check the plane out. They couldn't do this. The Germans couldn't do this. They had no way to land. So if you're going to do this in a round-trip fashion, you have to have a truly intercontinental bomber. And this is something the United States didn't have until the B-36, which was 1949-1950.
Their best chance is with the Blohm and Voss 222 flying boat. But the odds of it making it back to the fatherland are slim to none.
Well, I flew the 222, and I would certainly agree it could get to within range of the American coast. It was a pretty impressive flying boat. I do not believe that they could ever have attacked the American coast and got away with it, because So it had this tremendous range, and it was nice, quite nice to fly. It had quite light handling controls. It was very vulnerable to a fighter attack, and I just don't see it surviving any attack by any fighter at all, frankly.
12,000 miles would be needed in order to strike. No plane during this time can even come close in covering a distance this size. The Germans' longest-range bomber, the Heinkel 177, is encountering numerous problems with its unworkable tandem engine arrangement.
They didn't really get around to building 4-engine bombers, and when they did, it was an off and on type of thing. So one general actually was fired over this idea that he didn't come up with a 4-engine bomber later on in the war, Ernst Udet. He was marginalized and then committed suicide, probably over this very issue.
A plane of this magnitude must instead be designed from scratch.
But they realized it would have to be a very long-range bomber. For all intended purposes, you're looking at the German equivalent of the B-29.
And in order for it to work, an enormous amount of time and material is needed for production, development and testing, something the Germans are lacking by this time.
There were lies about the stocks of aluminium available. Production had not been rationalized, civilian resources had not been mobilized, and there was still a belief on the part of fighter pilots that quality was what mattered and that you would only get that by producing aircraft in relatively small numbers. So mass production was avoided. In 1944, Britain alone had 12 factories that employed more than 10,000 people. Germany only had 2.
Despite these roadblocks, Adolf Hitler, having a fascination with wonder weapons, enthusiastically gives a green light to the project. The America bombers are born. To provide a buffer of relief, Nazi planners believe they have a perfect halfway point. The Azores, an archipelago of 9 islands located 900 miles east off neutral Portugal, is ideal for a project of this nature.
Now they realized that the distances were huge. Actually, that's why they considered using the Azores as a base. It's halfway across, not quite halfway across the Atlantic, but it's certainly closer than bombing from bases in France. So there was definitely an interest there.
In 1940, after the fall of France, Admiral Raeder strongly urged Hitler to occupy them before the Americans could get to the islands first.
At one time, it was speculated, even Hitler suggested, that perhaps they should invade the Azores and take over the Azores and use it as a jumping off point for their long-range aircraft to fly to the States.
Now, if German planes are given permission to land the same way German U-boats are allowed to dock, this geostrategic area would be worth its weight in gold. Having the range requirements significantly reduced, the plan to bomb America now appears more feasible than ever. What is needed now are targets. In order to cripple the arsenal of democracy, these hypothetical German planes cannot just bomb indiscriminately. They instead must go right after their means of production, attacking factories that are building the planes and bombs that are ruining German cities. Prepared by the War Department in April of 1942, a 33-page document lists 21 potential targets for the Germans to attack. The Aluminum Company of America, located in Messina, New York. The Chrysler Corporation in Detroit. The Wright Aeronautical Company in Cincinnati, Ohio, and many others are the destinations for the America bombers. The targets and the takeoff are set. In looking for companies to build these super bombers, the Nazi regime goes to the very best.
They came up with some designs. Of course, every builder would come up with, every aircraft manufacturer would come up with a design, and they would take a look at the designs on paper and select one.
Messerschmitt, makers of the Me-109 and the 110, 2 planes that battled Spitfires and Hurricanes during the Battle of Britain. It's also the company that's working on the revolutionary Me-262, the first jet-powered aircraft. Beginning in the late 1930s, Messerschmitt begins dabbling in what is known as Secret Project P1061. Its requirements are for an aircraft capable of reaching bases in Central Africa as well as Vichy French territories. Now, the plan calls for a plane that can reach the United States, carrying a payload of 5,000 kilograms.
Messerschmitt came up with an idea that got off the ground, the Messerschmitt 264, and they originally wanted something like 6 prototypes for testing. And if these were proved successful, then they were going to build a fleet of them.
Awarded the contract by the German government, workers at Messerschmitt begin working on the aircraft known as the Me-264. Different versions are considered, and once the plane begins taking shape, it starts to look eerily similar to another design that's being constructed across the ocean.
So by and large, there were designs. I think there was a Messerschmitt 264, which looks a little bit like a B-29.
The 264 was actually quite an interesting aeroplane design. It had a circular fuselage section, which in stress terms was very, very good, because the circle has equal stress points. It was built over a long period of time, and it didn't actually fly until 1942.
Originally designed with 4 BMW 801G engines, German officials hoped that a 6-engine version will be in the skies as early as the fall of 1943. However, designers are noticing that the first prototype of the aircraft has a very high wing load. This is resulting in a loss of maneuverability, an unimpressive climb rate, and in-flight instability. 2 more prototypes are to be tested, one with armaments and one that is to be fully completed. However, with the aircraft being years away from flying, alternative designs and designers are sought out. Junkers, makers of the Stuka dive bomber and the Ju-52 transport plane, present their vision of a transoceanic aircraft capable of bombing Uncle Sam. The company is highly favoured amongst top Luftwaffe officials when it's taken over by the government in 1935, following the death of its founder, Hugo Junkers. Having overseen the company's nationalisation personally, Field Marshal Erhard Milch leans towards the alternative. One of their planes already on the books is the Ju-290, an evolution of an earlier design with a greater wingspan, used for long-range maritime reconnaissance and bringing supplies to German soldiers, most notably during their encirclement at Stalingrad.
The 290 had the advantage of having a roll-on, roll-off capacity for equipment, because it had a rear door that could be dropped. And that was the big advantage. You didn't need to have trucks to load it and unload it. You could actually drive on and drive off. And that was the major advantage of the 290.
The train of thought now is to just enlarge this aircraft for bombing America. The result is the Ju-390, a plane with 6 1700 horsepower engines, a wingspan of 181 feet, and a fuselage that is even longer than the American B-29.
Junkers were actually adapting their Ju-290 aircraft into the Ju-390, which was actually a 6-engined aircraft. And a lot of people, especially the German Navy, thought that would be quite a nice aeroplane, and others thought that yes, it would make a very nice America bomber.
The Ju-390 was a similar situation. There were 2 built that we know of. One was given to Hans Bauer, the Hitler's pilot. So it was for Hitler's use, for state use. So Hitler had a 390.
Built at the Junkers factory in Dessau, the first prototype is able to make its maiden flight in August of 1943.
They had high hopes for this bomber, and between this and the Messerschmitt 264, it looks like that much time, or if not in total time, these were controlled by the SS.
Despite its early success, the Nazi hierarchy still wants an insurance policy. On August the 11th, 1938, the nation of Germany makes history when a Focke-Wulf Condor arrives in New York City after a rigorous 24-hour flight across the Atlantic.
There was still this belief in the USA that they were very safe, and isolationism was still very, very rife there, and that any kind of invasion from abroad would have been almost impossible. However, in 1938 an event occurred which changed all that. This was that on the 10th of August 1938, a Focke-Wulf 200 took off from Berlin-Staaken and flew right across the Atlantic and landed at Floyd Bennett Field in New York after a 24-hour, 59-minute flight, non-stop. This put the wind up senior military people who suddenly realised that they weren't quite as safe as they thought.
Having proved itself capable of flying long distances, the aircraft goes to work during the war, providing reconnaissance for U-boat operations.
The Focke-Wulf 200, it was of course the civil Condor at one stage, and then it was militarized to become the Courier. And in fact, as the Courier, it was very successful as a reconnaissance aircraft over the Atlantic. It was very heavily armed, and it had a wide range, and where it did the damage was it could operate beyond fighter range from England or from Britain.
Now, the plan is to evolve the Condor the same way that the 290 is being evolved. The result is the TA-400, consisting of 6 BMW 1700 horsepower engines. Just to keep this monster up in the air, an unprecedented 32 fuel tanks, capable of carrying 7,000 gallons of gasoline, are put on board the aircraft. Possessing a pressurized cockpit, 2 remote-controlled turrets, 20mm cannons, and a payload of 22,000 pounds. The third of the America bombers appears to be the deadliest. As Germany struggles to find a way to attack the United States, many options are looked at. Submarines, space rockets, and espionage are appealing, but the most realistic strategy by 1942 is a long-range bomber. 3 companies, Messerschmitt, Junkers, and Focke-Wulf, all bring their designs to the table and begin working on planes that can render a decisive blow against America.
Russia did not actually capitulate. And in the winter of 1941, it actually launched a counterattack in front of Moscow. And there began a phase of the war which was to last more or less till its end. It was a war of attrition, a war eventually to be on 2 fronts, precisely the war the Germans always knew they couldn't win.
By 1944, the tide has turned in favour of the Allies.
Beginning in 1943, the American Air Force and the RAF, the British Air Force, were mounting 1,000-plane raids against Germany. By 1944, these raids were creating havoc in Germany. 3 raids against the city of Hamburg resulted in something like 50,000 German dead. The cities in Germany were being destroyed, leveled at the rate of something like 2 a month.
While the principles of war remained unchanged, the use of new weapons revised the concept of war. This time, Germany was faced with a weapon that leaped over battle lines and frontiers and smashed at the ultimate enemy, the German worker, who equipped and fed the German soldier. This time, the enemy nation was physically destroyed before its defending army was defeated.
But as the Allies came to rely increasingly on a strategy of strategic air power as a way of bringing Germany low, the need became pressing for some sort of escort fighter, and of course, that need was met in the P-51.
The P-38 was available at first, then the P-47. Neither had the range to be able to escort
the bombers all the way from England to Germany and back. The P-51 was the first that could do that. So now you had bombers flying raids all the way into the heart of Germany, even as far as Berlin, being able to have a very effective fighter escort the whole way there and back.
In England, Operation Overlord, the invasion of France, is being planned by both British and American generals for later that year.
At D-Day, in the final planning, the head of Allied tactical aviation was asked, well, what are we going to do about the German fighters? He said there aren't going to be any German fighters overboard. And he was essentially right, because they'd been wiped out by then. So, I mean, you know, it had a huge effect, I think, on the whole course of the war, of being able to bring the fight directly to the German tactical aviation forces.
For a Germany in its last throes, they begin turning to the secret weapons they have invested so much time and money into as the saviors that can strike a knockout blow.
The Holy Grail was a weapon of mass destruction. And they had gone the road of the nuclear, hoping to get the nuclear bomb. They had gone the road of the V1 and the V2. But they were always, as I say, searching for that Holy Grail.
August of 1944, Hitler and Mussolini met in Germany. Mussolini took a train to Germany, and they had a little heart-to-heart talk. Mussolini said to Hitler, look, I've been deposed once, I've been reinstalled in northern Italy. The Allies are in Italy. The Allies are closing in, the Russians are closing in from the east. It's August of 1944, and what guarantee do I have, if I still throw in my cards with you, Adolf Hitler, that you can actually pull this war out, because it's not looking good now. And Hitler said to Mussolini in so many words, I have some wonder weapons coming.
In Peenemünde, the Luftwaffe is working overtime, getting the V1 flying bomb ready to launch. And if this device fails, the revolutionary V2 rocket is going to strike the fear of God into the Allies, being the predecessor of today's intercontinental ballistic missile.
The V1 and the V2 were extremely important in terms of later weapons development. The V2, of course, a single glance at it will make clear that it is the ancestor of the later ICBM, the intercontinental ballistic missile. But perhaps even more than that for most Americans, it is clearly the ancestor of our NASA effort to reach space.
The target for both these weapons is London, where no one will be spared. Britain's ally, the United States, is also set to receive a deadly dose of a different type of wonder weapon.
The Americans were using Great Britain as an aircraft carrier to bomb Germany. Bombing England or bombing London alone, the British may have said no more, but there's no guarantee that the Americans were even going to let them do that at this point. They were so intent upon crushing Germany, and they had the Russians moving in from the east. So for a lot of political reasons, you have to stop this at the source. So the Germans were interested in bombing New York City, number 1, Moscow, number 2, and London, number 3.
In order to strike fear across the Atlantic, the America bombers are being hurried along. As development continues, the Nazi leadership is hoping to get at least one of these planes across the ocean to deliver a fatal blow.
The Junker 390, which was tested in a flight that managed to remain aloft for something like 12,000 miles, which would easily have made a round trip to the United States. And one of the practice runs they ran within 12 miles of the U.S. coast. The Germans even had another bomber in their plans, and that was a Messerschmitt plane, the Me-264. It was also tested and very likely could have struck the United States.
If this plan proves successful, the psychological impact could be the German equivalent of the Doolittle raid.
Yeah, the targets for the Me-264 would obviously have been preferred to be military targets. But the propaganda value of simply dropping a few bombs on New York would have had an amazing effect both in the USA and on the morale in Germany. In the USA, it would have no doubt caused a lot of panic and created a lot of defensive maneuvers within the East Coast because they didn't know if and when the bombers could come back.
In bombing the United States, the Germans saw that they could politically damage the United States, to damage the American leadership so much that the Americans would reconsider their quest for total victory. That, in other words, that the Germans could do a deal. The Germans could do an armistice on the Western Front and perhaps keep fighting the Soviets. They really didn't like the Soviets. The Americans and the British they didn't, that wasn't part of the bargain when they started the war. They really didn't, they looked upon us as more of a nuisance that got to festered and became a huge problem for them. So they would have always liked to just do away with us and continue fighting the Soviets.
As intelligence leaks, President Franklin Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill begin to worry about the secret weapons Germany might have in store for them.
Franklin Roosevelt was very conscious of the capacity of German science. And indeed, in 1944, in December of that year, one of his agents who was posted in Turkey, which was a hotbed of international espionage, reported to him that the Germans had mastered another weapon called the V3, and that it was capable of attacking the United States. Now, Roosevelt took this threat seriously. In fact, he confided to one of his people that he understood that a single bomb launched in this method could destroy a United States city. So he put the East Coast on alert when this attack presumably was going to happen. Obviously, it did not occur, but it pointed out the potential of German science.
If resources are diverted, England will be softened up for the eventual launchings of the V1 and the V2. The only thing that Germany does not have on its side is time. By 1944, as the America bombers are being developed, Germany remains in a weakened state. Being pounded into submission day and night by Allied planes taking off from the coast of England, and with the Soviet Union moving in from the east, it's no longer an if, but when the Nazis will surrender. Their factories cannot continue unless a dramatic reversal of fortune occurs. Only a miracle weapon can save them, which, along with the V1 and the V2, is hopefully the planes designed to pulverize Uncle Sam. However, just as the project begins to develop, the dominoes begin to fall, lessening the chances that one of these planes will make it up into the skies before it's too late. The first of these is the decision by the Portuguese government to lease the Azores bases to the Allies. Sensing which direction the war is going in, the neutral nation turns away from the German plan to launch the America bombers from their territory. This key strategic site, where the Third Reich planned to base these planes, is now only a distant memory. As German cities and industries crumble, Luftwaffe officials are forced to make drastic cuts. In many respects, the America bombers are typical of the hundreds of secret projects being mismanaged that become the Achilles heel of the Luftwaffe.
Right up to the last day of the war, they were working on 138 different guided missile projects. How can a nation which is on its knees be expending effort like this? Fortunately for us, they were expending this sort of effort through total mismanagement and lack of control of their resources.
And one of the failures of the German Luftwaffe was their inability ever to work out a sane procurement and production process. Prototypes would be built and abandoned. They would be rebuilt and altered by Hitler's order and abandoned, and rebuilt a third time and perhaps put into production as an aircraft very, very different from what the original designers had intended. This took place throughout the war. Compared to, for example, U.S. procurement policies, which become a giant bureaucracy, embodied in the War Department and soon thereafter, World War II, embodied in the Pentagon. The Germans were simply not able to compete on that level.
Only 3 Me-264s had actually been ordered, out of which only 1 was realized, and the other 2 were still in small parts, and nothing really serious was taking place there. And then out the blue, the RLM, the German Air Ministry, asked if they could produce 30 Me-264s. But then everybody realized that where would they build them, how would they build them, and from what would they build them? It was really, the boat had been missed on any of that.
The resources, the time, the crews, the ground support equipment, the bases, because you can't base aircraft of that size on a grass field. You need all the infrastructure. You have to get the bombs to the base, you have to get the fuel to the base, and not just once. You have to get the fuel coming back constantly, day after day after day. It's a huge infrastructure that the Americans, the British had to put up in Great Britain. The UK was a giant service station. It's hundreds, thousands of aircraft had to be refueled constantly. That infrastructure did not exist in occupied Europe for a large bomber force. Because sending 2 aircraft every week, what's the point?
With resources strained, planes still in their design stage are now in the crosshairs. One aircraft that's on the chopping block is Focke-Wulf's Ta-400. After assessing its design and noticing it requires more labour and materials than the Me-264, the decision to cancel it is made in late 1943.
They investigated and then realised that to actually build it and make it fly would take so many years that it was just impractical to even consider the project as being feasible.
Even as the prototype of the Ju-390 proves to be feasible, by mid-1944, all orders of that plane and the 290 are cancelled.
Again, it would have taken a vast amount of space and material and everything to build. And it really, the performance of the 390 didn't come up to what was expected. So that idea didn't go any further, although the German Navy quite liked the aeroplane.
Now, the only hope is with Messerschmitt.
One was destroyed on the ground. The program was canceled, as all German programs were. It's a start-stop attitude. So it may have been started and stopped several times.
Because of the changing situation of the war, and people had lots of ideas for strategic bombing. One day they were for it, the next day they were against it, and specifications were sort of being issued left, right, and centre. Messerschmitt actually did produce a large number of projected modifications to his 264, but none of them ever came to any fruition. I mean, there were ideas to attach huge fuel tanks to the airplanes, which could be 600-gallon fuel tanks carried externally. Also, a 6-engine version was proposed. But all this was real pie-in-the-sky stuff, because none of it could really be achieved at that time of the war. Things were really starting to go bad for Germany, and a lot of this stuff was just panic measures, trying to sort of clutch things out of the air, which really were just not possible.
With the continued bombardment causing a severe strain on the country's resources, Erhard Milch decides to stall production of the 264 and instead focus on the 262. The priority now is defence, and the hope is that this jet fighter bomber can shoot down the flying fortresses that have been pounding them into submission. That same year, several Allied bombing raids on the Messerschmitt factories damage all of the 264s beyond repair. By October of that year, the aircraft is cancelled indefinitely. All of these factors combined spell doom for the America bombers.
This is a solemn but glorious hour. I wish that Franklin D. Roosevelt had lived to see this day. General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations. The flags of freedom fly all over Europe.
In the more than 60 years since the Nazi regime was destroyed, many questions surrounding the America bombers program remain unsolved.
When we interrogated William Messerschmitt, he pooh-poohed it as if, I really had nothing to do with it. I think they realized they were going down a blind alley with that, really.
For a project cloaked in secrecy, rampant rumors begin spreading in the decades following VE Day. One such rumor is the assertion that the Ju-390 successfully made a reconnaissance flight of approximately 12,000 miles from occupied France to New York Harbor.
The fact that a Junkers Ju-390 came within 12 miles of New York is something that's said by many sources. It's not just one source. This isn't a wild and crazy guy saying this. This is something that is said and repeated, and I believe to be true.
A hypothetical question asked is, what impact would these planes have had if they were successful in carrying out bombing raids on American cities?
But I would say that even if the Germans could have put 2 or 3 aircraft together that could somehow make that perilous flight across the Atlantic and lob a couple of bombs into lower Manhattan, I think the political impact would have been tremendous. At the very least, President Roosevelt would have been forced to redeploy anti-aircraft assets from Britain, where they were protecting Britain against German air attack, to the continental United States. And that might have had some appreciable impact on the future course of operations in Western Europe.
If the United States had actually suffered on its shores serious damage from German rocketry or from other transoceanic bombers such as they intended, the probably impact on the war would be that it would have been extended. Given the great industrial, innovative powers of the United States as demonstrated in that war by our production, the development of an atom bomb, no doubt we would have struck back, but it certainly would have extended the war to have the destruction brought to our shores.
I wouldn't say a waste of resources, but to a large extent, the hopes of actually curtailing, even annoying the Americans was very small. They might have annoyed them all right, but that would not have been good because the Americans might simply have reacted by bombing the German factories and the bases more fiercely than they did. So in the end, chances are, even that the Germans built the bombers and the bases, they would not have remained in operation very long. They may not even have been completed before they got pulverized.
Would they have been able to crack the well-oiled American war machine by 1945? Would they have been able to weaken civilian morale?
When you look at the effect of the German bombing of England during the Blitz, it's pretty clear it strengthened British resolve. It caused more of a feeling of we've got to get back at those guys rather than fomenting this attitude of, oh, there's no point, we should surrender. So if you're talking about strategic bombing as trying to sap the morale of the enemy, the evidence is pretty clear that doesn't work.
Naturally, the American people probably felt very secure having an entire ocean between ourselves and the war that was raging in Europe. What effect, let's say, on morale would have occurred had the Germans been able to strike us directly? I think it would have been very likely the parallel with London and Berlin. These places were smashed. Berlin was practically reduced to rubble by 1,000-plane raids, but people kept their chins up. They managed to take it and went on from day to day. I don't believe that the American people would have reacted anyway differently.
It's very difficult for people who have not been involved in a war like that, or have not gone through the experience, to understand that war to us had become a condition which to us was no more different than the weather. It was something we had to live with. You could talk about it, but you couldn't do a darn thing about it. And the fact that cities got destroyed or submarines got sunk or whatever, it was just part of war, and we took it very naturally somehow without being as dismayed as we are today when we read history.
The plan to bomb America proved appealing to many in the High Command, an act of revenge against a nation that seemed impregnable. Like many other secret Nazi projects, however, a firm lack of purpose and direction existed. The bureaucracy in place at the time and the continued destruction of German factories and cities guaranteed that aircraft like these, despite their potential, would never get off the ground. Instead, these planes and the men behind them remain a pipe dream, one of the Second World War's greatest what-ifs.